We're going to try and liven this up a little bit. We're going to make this a highly, in absence of the caffeine, we're going to try and make this session very lively. I'm warning you a little bit that Josh and I, when we get together, the sparks start to fly. So I'm not an academic, I'm not from your world, so I don't know the cultural protocols. We're going to have a discussion today about China-Africa. You're privileged to have the opportunity to hear from Josh, who is really one of the veterans of the business. He and I both started in this space more than a decade ago, long before it was fashionable. China-Africa relations, in many ways, is one of the least understood of China's international engagements, but among the most important. Africa is a theater for the Chinese, where they go to do experiments and pilots and to do things that they can't do in any other part of the world, whether that's in economics, in trade, in diplomacy, in education, or, as we're going to find out today, in the political, military realm as well. So, today's discussion is going to be about Professor Eisenman's new book that is going to be coming out from Columbia University Press. That is a huge accomplishment from what I understand in the academic world. So, we're going to, before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, I think it's important that we acknowledge the role that Ambassador David Shinn played in the book. That was your co-author. For those of you who are not familiar, Ambassador David Shinn is also one of the greats in the China-Africa space. He's a former ambassador to Ethiopia and Burkina Faso from the United States. And he's been a really provocative thinker in this space. So the fact that you were able to partner with him is an amazing accomplishment. Let's start very quickly that most people, when they think of the China-Africa relationship, let's think of what comes to mind. Resources, trade, neocolonialism, imperialism. These are the words that if we had a word cloud that you would see when you, debt trap. Most of the themes of the China-Africa relationship in the public perception today are economic. You and Ambassador Shin, though, decided to do a book on political and military ties. Let's start there.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. For those of you who know this space, Eric is kind of the rock star of this space. He's running one of the most important podcasts. He's interviewing Chinese, Africans, Americans, Europeans, everywhere around. And now he's branching out to the global south as well. So I'm privileged to be here sitting next to him. It's the Mutual Admiration Society here. But one thing I can start off by saying, and I will get to your question, is that I've noticed over time that there's a difference in the way that people who study Africa, and maybe Africans, broadly speaking, and I'm speaking very broadly here, see China and Africa, and those of us, like myself, who study China and China's engagement with the world. And I would broadly say that people who are Africanists and who are from Africa see China as one of maybe the latest group of foreigners to arrive on the continent. And so they look at things in a comparative context. Well, the Chinese compared to the French, the Chinese compared to the Americans, the Chinese compared to the Russians, etc. And then they say, well, who's better, who's worse? And this goes to something that Yunan was saying earlier about giving options, right? Who's our best option out there? But for those of us, and I include you in the mix, who study China, we tend to look at China-Africa relations as a subset of China's engagement with the global south, or the developing world, as it used to be called, or the third world, or whatever we're calling it these days. And then that, China in the global, so China-Africa is part of China in the global south, China in the global south is part of China's geostrategy writ large. And so we tend to ask the question, this is us who look at China, what is China doing in Africa, and how does that reflect its strategy in the world? And so this is just a different perspective. Now, working with Ambassador Shin, which is an honor, and this is our second book working together. Our first book, which was published in 2012 by the University of Pennsylvania Press, I'm thrilled to tell you, was translated into Chinese by the Chinese University of Hong Kong Press. And if you can guess who it was translated by, it was translated by that wonderful gentleman, Professor Wang Tuanyong, in the back. And so this book, I'm proud to say, is the only book published in the People's Republic of China that is an uncensored book about China-Africa. It is 100% translated. There is no, the governor of Taiwan. No, we translated it robustly. And so this is then, to get to your question, building off of that approach, which was a whole of China-Africa approach. In the first book, we looked at China's engagement across the entire spectrum: trade, aid, investment, politics, security. And in 2011, when we finished the book, such an examination was possible. But as you know as well as anyone, Eric, we have had a ballooning of the field such that if one were to try to write that book today, it would be a multi-volume, we could fill this room full of paper because it's so. So one of the reasons we decided to look at this was because we needed to narrow our scope and focus it more. The second reason, and this is maybe a baseball analogy. I don't know how many baseball fans we have here in Israel, but Ted Williams, the great baseball player, once said, "You got to hit them where they aim." Right? You got to hit them where they aim. And the point is, if everybody is running to do the economics, and I'm not an economist, and neither is Ambassador Shin, well then you should study the things that other people aren't studying. So when we began to do this, when we first began this project in 2016, we noticed that there was a significant gap in the literature, because as you say, people were very much looking at the economic side of the equation. Ambassador Shin is an expert on the security side of the equation. I'm a political scientist. I've had 20 years of engagement with the International Department of the Communist Party of China through the American Foreign Policy Council, and I study the Communist Party of China's foreign policy writ large. So this gave us not only to hit them where they aim, but hit them where we live, which is we work on that stuff. And so we thought we brought comparative advantage. And we thought that that was a relatively empty space. Now, in the intervening period, more has been written about this, but that has only helped us because what has been written is not as robust as I might like it to be. And so we've been able to build on that growing literature, and my hope is that this book is a kind of crescendo, if you will, of that discussion. And therefore the China-Africa political and security relationship, which is growing rapidly and growing kind of beyond our sight, right? The economics, as Professor Wong showed us, that's what we can see. That's the part of the iceberg that's above the water. But the politics and security, that tends to live under the water. And so we try to shed light on that part.
Okay, well let's go there. What are we missing? What are we not seeing that you found in your research that I'm sure people in Washington and other capitals are going to be very interested to find out? What did you reveal in the research that went into this book?
Because now when I say you have to buy the book now. So what we did is we looked at a variety of different elements of the China-Africa Paul Mill relationship, the political security relationship. Now, I, as the China side of the equation, and the guy who's not as steeped in the security, my work in the book is primarily focused on the Communist Party's role, the international diplomacy aspects, the propaganda work that we're seeing. I have a report coming out from USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, next month, full report on China's propaganda work in Africa, and that's a chapter in the book as well. And so, some things I think we're not necessarily appreciating, I would say first, propaganda is not just media propaganda. For China, propaganda is also educational propaganda, right? The Confucius Institutes, etc. It's also cultural propaganda. You know, those acrobat troops that are going, or you were going around Africa, they're not doing that because they like to do acrobatics. That's their job. They're part of the party-state apparatus to enhance the way that Africans view China, right? And so there's a whole set of cultural, and what China likes to call people-to-people engagements, but what are really party-to-people engagements, that we either see what we want to see or see what we're used to seeing and say, okay, this is just like this, but it's not. It's party-driven. And so we shed light on that. We shed light on the role that the Communist Party of China's international department is playing in terms of building relations with African political parties. And they're doing this around the world, but in Africa they've got an amazing group of partner parties that work with them across the ideological spectrum. Left to right, Islamist to secular, you name it, the Communist Party of China's international department will engage you. Now, that's not to say that they don't have an ideology or an ideological game. They will engage anyone, but that doesn't mean that they are not in themselves having some kind of agenda, right? So I would say these are two important things. In addition, we look at security aspects, including the role of AI, the role of African collaboration, military diplomacy between the African militaries and the Chinese military. The People's Liberation Army is docking all around Africa in different ports. And I'll give you one anecdote. We are in Ghana. In the People's Liberation PLA Daily newspaper, they had an article about how these ships were docking in Ghana. But in Ghana, it wasn't even in the press and nobody knew it was even happening. right? So we've got a kind of whole level of mill-to-mill cooperation and arms sales, etc., that are going along with it, which are almost unseen by most of us. And we've really tried to shed light on that and try to elucidate that. There's a whole variety of security issues that we can unpack if you want.
So one of the things, if you've been following the news over the past, say, 2 or 3 months, is the colossal meltdown in Washington about the presence or possibility of Chinese military bases in different parts of the world. This first started in Equatorial Guinea, where the United States Africa Commander, General Stephen Townsend, said that Equatorial Guinea is open to hosting a Chinese base. It then moved to my neighborhood in Southeast Asia with the Cambodians, and there's a freak out about the fact that the Cambodians might be building a base for the Chinese. And then now recently in the South Pacific on the Solomon Islands. China is the largest navy in the world. It's the second largest economy in the world. It is a superpower by any definition. The United States government continually says it does not want to impede China's growth. It does not want to block. It does not want to contain. But yet every time China sets up or has a conversation with a country in Africa, even in Djibouti where that base is, there is a panic. How do you reconcile those two positions from the United States and Europe also as well on China's legitimate military interests in other parts of the world?
Well, I think that in order to understand the evolution, we have to step back a little bit. And when you and I began studying China-Africa relations, if you were to walk into the office of somebody who studies Chinese foreign policy, and you were to say in 12 years or whatever, China's going to have a military base in Djibouti, they would say, you are China threat theorists, and you don't understand China because this is not Chinese policy. We will never have overseas military bases. That's imperialism. Well, that has evolved, right? And so you mentioned the base in Djibouti, which was, I think, their first overseas military
And to date,
base.
their only one, as what we know.
Now, see, this is always questionable, right? If you're building, like, the base of Gwadar, there have been PLA ships that have docked there. Is that a base? I don't know. What is the definition of base? But yes, as far as I understand, that is the only Chinese overseas military base. And Ambassador Shin and I, in our field work, we visited Djibouti, and we talked to people about this issue. And there have been...
What did they say? You were at Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, which is Camp Lemonnier is the U.S. military base. And for those of you who want to get a sense of the geography of Djibouti, if you think Israel is small, Djibouti is much smaller. Israel's a giant country compared to Djibouti. There is probably the distance between the bases is less than a mile.
I mean, it's very close. And there are also, we should hasten to add, many other foreign military bases in Djibouti.
Japan, Italy, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and France.
So China joined that club, right? I guess the difference with China, and Yunnan knows perhaps better than I, is that Djibouti has like 80% of its debt with China, right? So Djibouti is one of these small handful of countries that really is up to its nose in debt to China. Okay? And so when you combine the economic and the security issues, you can imagine there's a great deal of Chinese influence, right? Now, I think that...
I will challenge you on that. I think Djibouti has the upper hand on this. And I think the Washington consensus on the debt in Djibouti is China can control Djibouti. Djibouti has the one thing that China doesn't have, which is real estate, location. And they're going to say, the family's not going to pay back the debt. They're going to say, you don't want to pay, we're not paying back the debt. If you don't like it, you can leave. And they're never going to leave.
So getting to your point, what is the U.S. concern?
Yeah.
So what happened in Djibouti that we know? We know that, as far as, I think we know, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that, from that base, the Chinese folks were aiming lasers at the eyes of U.S. pilots who were...
The Chinese deny it, but go ahead.
They
be fair here.
There are just vocational training in Xinjiang as well, in case you didn't, right? So there's a lot of denials, but the truth is that I believe that those lasers were being focused in our interviews at Camp Lemonnier. They were very clear about it, and I'm satisfied that it occurred, right? These are not the droids you're looking for. That doesn't suffice it for me. So ultimately, this can show you some of the concerns, right? To have the Chinese military base in such proximity to the U.S. and its allies, to be able to have signals, intelligence, and other kinds of intelligence collection activities that close to U.S. military assets, I think it's a concern that is realistic. Now the Chinese say that they put the base there because they're afraid of piracy. And maybe initially that was the case. But that piracy, as I understand it, has more or less subsided. But yet the base remains. And so it seems that this is a kind of, maybe a canonical case, it's the only case. But it shows why they're concerned about the west coast of Africa. Because what they see in Djibouti has already led them to be concerned about this issue. So the last thing they do is want more of this.
So the piracy that Josh was talking about was part of the multinational anti-piracy coalition that was the European Union, NATO, the United States, and others off the coast of Somalia. It's been 5 years since there's been a pirate incident, so Somalia has said we don't want the multinational troops there anymore in the piracy. So if it's not piracy, it faces out onto the Gulf of Aden, it faces out onto the Indian Ocean, it has convenient access to the Gulf into the Suez Canal. What is the purpose today of the base and going forward?
Well, again, I want to hasten to add that, I don't, of course, don't work for the Chinese government.
No, but
they may
based on
answer
your
their own
research,
way.
what did you find?
But, so our good friend, Andrea Giseli, has written a book about China's military engagement in Africa and in the Middle East. And I think a lot of it comes down to what we saw in 2011 in Libya, where you had thousands of Chinese and a lot of Chinese interests which came under threat, and the Chinese response was slow, it was delayed, it wasn't exactly as robust as they would have liked it to be, and they ended up, I think, having to use cruise ships and other things to change things. Maybe something similar happened in Yemen as well. So as China's economic interests have grown, so has its desire to protect those economic interests. Similarly, as Chinese people, more of them have moved to Africa and become more engaged on the continent, protecting those people has also become important, and that requires some level of assets. And the most popular Chinese movie in the history of Chinese movies is Wolf Warrior 2, which is about Chinese people, Chinese military assets in Africa, right? And of course, the bad guys are a bunch of Americans who need to be. It's very much a kind of Rambo approach. So we've been there.
Good fun, the movie.
I couldn't get through it.
Let's transition to a different topic. The Chinese they always love to tout the fact that they are the largest contributor of peacekeepers among the P5 countries. In Africa, more of their peacekeepers are on the ground, mostly in humanitarian support roles, medical, engineering, tech support and whatnot. But there have been 2 deployments. Again, I said at the beginning that Africa is a testing ground for China. They've deployed armed, for the first time anywhere in the world, armed blue helmet soldiers under UN command from the PLA to South Sudan. And then they deployed People's Action Police forces into Mali as well. Tell us a little bit about the multinational component of the Palm Mill relationship.
Okay, now I have to be modest here and tell you that Ambassador Shin is really maybe the world's great expert on this, which is why I'm so privileged to work with him. But I should hasten to add that, to my knowledge, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the P5, while especially the US, is the #1 financial contributor, right? So we're paying. We are not necessarily deploying troops.
We're in arrears though, but we're paying.
Okay, we're paying. The other UN member states, which are not P5 members, have contributed more troops than China. So
That's right. It's specific among the P5.
But in terms of the UN General Assembly, I'm not sure exactly where they rank. It may not even be in the top 5 in terms of contributors. So we have to add this important caveat to the discussion. But the Chinese People's Liberation Army's contribution to this, I think it has a variety of aspects. One of them is, it's good public diplomacy, right? We've got our blue helmets on, we're keeping peace and security, we're doing good work. But also, we'd be fools if we didn't notice there's an intel collection aspect to this, right? And there's a best practices aspect to this. When you're working with foreign militaries, you can learn from them, you can learn about them. You can learn what's going on the ground. And we would be, I think, remiss if we didn't think that plenty of intel is being funneled back into the Baidalo, so the Chinese Pentagon, from these peacekeepers. Now, this is not to detract from the contribution they may make to peacekeeping, but we also have to understand that Chinese peacekeepers have a multifaceted responsibility, shall we say.
What do you think of the idea that China has not fought a war since the Sino-Vietnamese War in Border War in 1978 and 1979? And so, in a conflict with the United States or any of its neighbors, which pick your neighbor and there could be any number of them, they don't have command and control experience, they don't have combat experience, they don't have logistics experience. And we're seeing now in Ukraine the importance of logistics. To what extent do you think deployments in places like South Sudan or Kenya are a safe place to get that experience of on the ground, put your sergeants and your commanders under some real life action situations to then apply elsewhere?
I mean, I think that's true. I think that's right. Now, and again, Ambassador Shin knows more about this than anyone, but I believe in Sudan they ran into some problems at times, right? And they did take some casualties, and this was a learning lesson.
And they didn't come, well, what happened is there was an attack on the base, and they all hid in the base, and they were scared. Now, they deny this. They say we weren't, but the locals say that when the attack came, they hid on the base. That was a long time ago. Since then, they have been engaged in combat.
I mean, I guess one could ask the question, if we think about where China is most likely to be engaged in the security aspect, I think we have to agree that Taiwan is the primary, and then elements of the South China Sea and along the Indian border. And one could ask the question, how much value is training your troops in Sudan to a Taiwan invasion, or how much is it, how effective is it to the fighting on the top of the Himalayan mountains with clubs and sticks, as we saw? And the answer is pretty little, I think. And so, to my mind, there is limited application for a lot of these deployments for actually Chinese efforts to achieve their revanchist goals. So, it's good to have some on-the-ground experience, but you should want your on-the-ground experience to be relevant. But I guess this is just this is the experience they can get, because this is where the blue helmets are.
Let's shift from the military into your expertise in the political. When China first went to Africa in the early 2000s under Hu Jintao, it was very much to secure resources and provide opportunities for state-owned enterprises, and to even at some point export labor and jobs and all of that. And that was prior to the Belt and Road. So most of what China was buying from Africa, they weren't buying elsewhere: oil, mineral, and timber. Ambassador Shin has a great statistic, which I absolutely love, that in 2008, 30% of Chinese oil was imported by 3 African countries: Cameroon, Republic of Congo, Angola, and Sudan. Of their imports. 2018, that number's down to 8%, and Angola is the only one in the top 10. So the economic relationship has shifted. The political relationship has gotten way more important today. Tell us the paradigm of the political relationship as it is today.
Let me start with that trade point you made. China is not only engaged in oil, but they're also deeply involved in minerals, timber. Fishing is a really big part of what they're doing. So simply because they've moved away from oil doesn't mean they're not heavily involved in the resources, which I do believe, and I haven't looked at the statistics, and Professor Wang knows the statistics almost at hand, but still make up the vast majority of China's imports from Africa are raw materials of some
70%.
70%, right? So you have them on hand as well. So even if it's not oil, it's something else. But to me, the biggest problem with the trade relationship is how amazingly unbalanced it is in almost all countries in Africa. And when I talk about imbalance, I mean, hey, I'm from the U.S. We know China trade deficits, right? We're the OG of China trade deficits. But even our trade deficits are nothing compared to Kenya, are nothing compared to Djibouti, are nothing compared to Ethiopia. In these cases, you're dealing with, of the total trade, 95+% are Chinese imports, right? And the other, you look at Ethiopian exports to China, it's like goat skins and sesame. Well, that ain't going to do it. And so it becomes a political issue, as it has in our country, right? The trade issue, when it goes on long enough, when you have sustained ongoing trade deficits, people notice that, it has a hollowing out effect, and it impacts the domestic politics in ways that are negative for China's image, and negative for the relationship.
There's a lot of frustration, though, in the outside world, because they're not paying attention to that. In the outside world, particularly in the US and Europe, they're accusing African governments of, in the Ukraine war, of the word now is fence-sitting. They accuse number of African governments are Muslim majority, and all African governments have sided with China on contentious issues like Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. Not very few. Eswatini is the only one because they recognize Taiwan. And so there's a frustration on the part of US diplomats and European diplomats as to why are these countries aligning themselves with what they perceive to be the biggest jerks in the world. That's their perception. I mean, just to use impolite language.
I mean, I guess this gets to this issue of the straw man of the debt trap diplomacy. Because from the Chinese perspective, if you will, it seems that if you engage somebody economically in a way that's beneficial for them, you create what in Chinese is a ren qing zhai. So you create, they owe you one, right? And if they can't return it in economics, they have to return it somehow. And so how do they return the favor? They return it by voting with you in the UN, by signing onto the letter for the Uyghurs. Because if you do that, or not signing on the Chinese letter, to be clear, not on the Western letter, the African countries, dozens of them, have supported China's policies in Xinjiang. Not just sat on the fence. They are on the record, right? Rwanda supports China's claims in the South China Sea. Okay? That's an easy giveaway, right? Nobody in Africa is inviting the Dalai Lama for dinner. And by the way, this gets to the kind of no strings attached. China has no strings attached in your country, but there are plenty of political strings attached if you violate what they consider their political interests, right? So invite the leader.
So I have an acronym for this. This is fun. 4THKXJSC, okay? Work with me here. 4T, Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, the party. Those are the lines you can't cross.
I like how you used the.
That's the way I squeezed in the party. HK is Hong Kong, XJ is Xinjiang, S is the South China Sea, and now we have a new one. The list, by the way, keeps getting longer, and that is COVID. So if you question the origins of COVID, you have crossed the red line. So those are the strings that are attached. No strings attached, except those
strings that are attached.
There's those strings that are attached.
But there are different kinds of strings, right? From the Western perspective, we don't care how you criticize the United States per se. I mean, we care your human rights record at home, right? So our strings are about what's going on in your country. Their strings are about what they consider to be their country. So I think it's important to just differentiate in terms of where those strings
are. Well, our strings are what you're doing in your country. So we give development aid on the condition of X, Y, Z, and that's what people find so offensive. Because governments say, you can't, in Africa, one of the big issues is LGBTQ issues in East Africa. Kagame in Rwanda, Kenyatta in Kenya, all said, don't lecture us on LGBT issues. And we don't want your money if that's what it is.
So getting back to the question that you asked about, the politics, we've seen just an extended effort to cultivate African elites. This is the education sphere is one of them. The scholarships that are given out. If we at Notre Dame are going to give scholarships to African students, those students have to apply to Notre Dame, right? They come to us, they apply, we evaluate their application, and we give plenty of scholarships. At the Keough School, most of our students are from the Global South. Let me repeat that. Most of the students who are pursuing MA degrees at the Keough School are from the Global South, and nearly all of them, I would say all, but I don't want to you find one person. To my knowledge, all of them are receiving large subsidies, support from the University of Notre Dame. But the U.S. Embassy is not going to go over to you and say, do you want a scholarship to Notre Dame? But the Chinese embassy is in the business of identifying elites in Africa and then providing them scholarships. And our friend Cliff Mboya is a great example, right?
Is that bad, what they're doing?
I wouldn't say it's bad, it's just different, right? And it takes a little bit more of a self-starter to go out and apply to a bunch of schools in America in the hope and the prayer than it does to take a phone call and say, okay, we have a scholarship for you, okay, I'll take it. Right? So it's a different approach. But I always remind African friends that we have a lot of support for you. You just have to ask for it. You've got to be proactive. Whereas the Chinese side may seek you out and then try to provide opportunities strategically. And so I got my start in China-Africa relations in Nanjing, at Nanjing University, hanging out and going to clubs with Africans. And I can tell you, these are not poor Africans, right? These are not necessarily even the best and brightest, but they are extremely well connected. They are elites, and they are, in many ways, cultivating their elite relations in China and building those relations with Chinese and with Africans and creating a guanshuang, like a relational circles that then can be useful later.
Yes and no. One of the key problems, it's been 20 years now in the China-Africa relationship, since about 2003 to today. every year 63,000 African students went to go study in China.
Until COVID.
Until COVID. We've talked to people in DIRCO, the South African Foreign Ministry. We said, how many China experts do you have? 5. Entire Foreign Ministry.
Ghana has 2.
Ghana has 2. Kenya has 1. Okay. African governments have been getting their clocks cleaned by the Chinese on contracts. In fact, in Uganda, the finance minister testified before a parliamentary committee and said, we did not understand the contract. Okay, I gave a briefing to some African ministers, and I said, how come your capacity on China isn't higher? You have 50 to 60,000 well-trained, fluent-speaking Chinese. You know what they say? Not the right ethnicity, not the right tribe, not the right political party. If you're not ANC, you don't get into the South African government. So at what point does this become the African agency issue than it is the China issue?
Well, the issue of African agency has been much discussed, right? And we're in a situation where if you ever say anything about the Africans don't have agency, well then you must be like somehow stripping them of agency. But the reality is when you go into, as we did, an interview, the folks in Ghana who hold the China portfolio, no, they don't speak any Chinese. Yes, they work in a building built by China, right? The building, the Foreign Ministry of Ghana is built by China. And I recall, we asked them, we said, well, when the whole spying incident at the African Union happened, the Chinese also built the African Union headquarters, and then they set up all of these servers, which they were recording what was going on, and then this was all being downloaded to Shanghai at 2 in the morning, and Le Monde broke this story. And I said, well, what did you do? And they said, well, for several weeks while we swept the building, we held our meetings in a Starbucks. Right? That's not agency, I submit to you. If you're holding your meetings in the Starbucks, it's kind of hard to suggest that you're on equal footing, because I have to tell you, those people who are working in China, and there's dozens of them, who are amazing at what they do and are good at it. And as you've told me, they're hiring people from the most highest law firms, and they're paying them well to negotiate those contracts. So, there are systemic problems here, right? And it's very easy to say, well, if you did a bad contract, it's your fault. You had agency, you blew it. I don't necessarily see it that way. I see when you've got systemic inequities, systemic asymmetries, it's impossible to sometimes overcome those asymmetries in a way that produces results that are favorable.
But Ghana's relationships with every country in the world is asymmetric because it's small. Its relationship with the United States is asymmetric. Its relationship with Japan is asymmetric. China's not unique there.
Let me tell you an anecdote that I thought was, as we flew into Ghana, we were flying from Ethiopia into Ghana. There was 3 Chinese men sitting next to me, and they were trying to fill out their visa forms and having a hard time with it because it's in English and Amharic. And so I speak Chinese, so I said, well, can I help you? And they said, oh, thank you, please. And I said, well, okay, according to the form, what are you doing there? And they point to their visa. Their visa says tourism. I said, okay, what are you doing there? Gold mining. Okay, how long are you going to stay? I don't know, 1 or 2 years maybe. What's their visa say? 2 months, tourists, right? We get there, we land. Before we get to security, a Ghanaian comes around, takes these Chinese guys by the hand and leads them in, right? So there is a kind of, could any of us imagine this happening in China? Could we imagine 3 Ghanaians showing up in Ghana on in China on tourist visas and going to Yunnan to mine jade ore? I mean, that's what I mean by asymmetry. I mean, at the very grassroots level, you have people who are conspiring to help.
Yes, but to be fair, Nigerians are doing the same thing in Ghana, Lebanese are doing the same thing in Ghana, and Indians are doing the same thing in Ghana.
Takes one to know.
The Chinese are not unique there by any stretch, but at the end of the day, the problem ultimately lies with the lack of Ghanaian governance than it does with the lack of the Chinese who are violating the system.
And this gets to a really interesting thing that we found when we were in Ghana, which was, I did interviews with both Ghanaian the ruling party and the former ruling party. The former ruling party, their headquarters, where I met them, was built by the Communist Party of China, stocked by the Communist China. I mean, literally, Chinese companies built it and funded it, right? So they were very happy. And the NPP, which was then had just come into power, I met them in a kind of really shabby building. There was one guy who was the entire international department of the party, not just for China, for the whole world. And this guy, he was very proud. He goes, look, you see this desk? The Chinese just gave it to me. See my new laptop? The Chinese just gave it to me. My brand new Huawei cell phone, my copier. And he just went through the office pointing and indicating each and everything that the Chinese embassy had provided him. And I said, and he had a Xi Jinping's book on his desk, right? This Xi Jinping little white, or big white book, big white book. And so I said, you know, are you concerned that you're using this phone the Chinese embassy gave you, that they may be listening to some of the things that you're saying? And he said, well, you know, let them listen, right? And so that's what I mean by asymmetry.
But that's what Paul Kagame said about the AU spying thing. He said, we should have built our own goddamn building. Sorry for the language, but those were his words exactly. If we didn't want to be spied on, we should build our own GD building.
I mean, I guess when you read the writings that the people in China talk about political parties, they see political parties as this essential node that touches every element of that society, every element of every policy. And so these are essential interlocutors. And the Communist Party of China isn't changing. It remains the ruling party of China. But in a place like Ghana, they've been amazingly successful at being able to work with both sides. And so whoever wins the election, they win. Right? That's the win-win, I guess, right? And then in other places, like Ethiopia, however, and in the ANC in South Africa, I would argue that they face some problems because they went all in on the EPRDF, which was the former ruling party of Ethiopia. They trained them, they had more exchanges with the EPRDF than any other ruling party in all of Africa. There was commentary that said, these are our, quote, best students on the continent, and do we all know what happened to the EPRDF? They're gone. They're gone. And so, in many ways, China has been, and I know this sounds a little funny, more successful in Africa in engaging in democracies than it has in autocracies, where if you bet wrong, who knows?
Okay, we have 20 minutes left. That's more than that's less time than I wanted for questions, but you can see, line the two of us up, and it just goes all night like this. There's a microphone there. How do we get that over to people? Let's take your questions. Okay, who's got questions? Good job, and the young man right in front. Yes, that's you, yes.
During the past year, there was a discussion in the European Union to give certain favorable recognition to gas that was found in Africa. In other words, they could define it as green rather than as polluted, whatever. And the decision was supposed to be taken now, or early this year. I don't know what happened to it. That's my first question. In other words, what interests me is the whole question of the future of Africa as a source of whatever. Now, for example, as far as I know, there isn't one single metal steel company in Africa other than in South Africa. On the other hand, China has the largest steel company in the world. So it would seem to me that the move could be and should be to create a steel company for green steel, if you like, in Africa. Use the raw materials that are there. Get tax exemptions and welcome it. That's my question.
Yeah, on the steel question, I'll just update you. Tsingshan, which is one of the largest mining companies and steel companies, is building $1 billion steel plant in Zimbabwe. And Nigeria has a number of steel factories as well. So South Africa is the main one, but it's starting to grow a little bit, but not much. Do you want to take any of those questions or any comments on that?
You know, I have to be honest with you, we've focused so much on the security and the politics that some of the economic investments, like you're talking about, we haven't been focusing on it. So I don't want to speak out of turn, and I think Eric may know
So
more.
I'll tell you a little bit of the reaction, though, that I've picked up on the continent from about the U.S. and the Europeans on natural gas and oil. And this goes to the sermonizing, the lecturing. For the past 5 years, all we've heard is that Africa needs to transition, the just transition away from hydrocarbons. And there's all these foundations, all these NGOs, all these governments pouring in money, telling African governments, you need to transition to green. Bear in mind, Africa contributes 3% to global climate emissions. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken last month comes rolling into Algeria. And what does he want? He wants gas for the white people. So all of a sudden, when Europe needs hydrocarbons, everything is fine. Africa's great, we want to buy up all your hydrocarbons. When Europe didn't need it, they said you have to go to just transition. Germany, in particular, has been lecturing Africa on not using coal. South Africa in particular. And what are the Germans doing right now? They're going back to coal. The hypocrisy is shocking. And part of the reason why the Chinese have had such success in Africa is that Westerners underestimate the resentment, the bitterness, and the toxicity of the relationship with the West. The King of Belgium was just in the Congo and could not come to apologize for the horrific atrocities that are there. So this is part of the problem on the natural gas issue. It is filled with resentment on the part from many African stakeholders about the dual policies that are there.
Now, what do you propose?
What's that?
What do you propose? What can happen? What can you do?
At least, and this is my big criticism of US and European policy in general, is if you're going to live by values, live by values. If you're going to say green is important, then live by it. But when the United States is the largest fossil fuel producer in the world, more than the Saudis, and they're talking about just transition to Malawians, it doesn't resonate. I think the United States and Europe lack credibility on this climate change issue.
Eric, I don't know if it's break ranks, but I would say this is a really complicated issue. I don't think there's anybody in Africa, Europe, or the US who really would be like, oh yes, let's please burn more fossil fuels, right? I think we all agree that we want to move away from this, but we also agree that it's hard, that it's going to take time, and that there's going to be a lot of hemming and hawing and hypocrisies as we have to deal with the consequences of this transition. So, I guess
I'll disagree with you. People say if you were able to burn fossil fuels for your economic development, and in Nigeria, for example, where wood burning is a big problem, going up to coal and to gas is actually cleaner than wood burning. It's actually a progression. And if that's what produces economic development, then power is the #1 problem in Africa today.
But who is facing the consequences of climate change more than any? The global South, right? So we can talk about what happened in the past and the British and the burning of coal, but where does that get us in terms of actually solving this problem? I'm not sure it does anything except for maybe, well, the British did a lot of horrible things, and so did, and so did the Americans, so did the French, so did the Chinese. But where does that get us in terms of not moving our thermostat 2 degrees higher and no sea level rise, And so, I don't have any answers on this, and this is not really something we deal with in the book, to be honest with you. But I think this is a much harder question than saying, oh, you're a hypocrite because now oil is $6 a gallon and so you're there. We live in a democracy, and in a democracy, you can get voted out. And so if the Communist Party of China has the ability to say, we're going to handle higher oil prices, that we can deal with that, we can push through it, I guarantee you, the Biden administration does not have that luxury given the approval ratings that the guy's facing. So it's political.
Who's asking questions? Anybody? Okay. The young man in the blue.
That's all right. We can do both. We can do both.
Okay, we'll let it.
Here comes the hard one.
I know, this is revenge.
Thanks. Okay. So, Josh, Eric, thank you so much. This is a great conversation. I'm just curious, the conversation about some of these things that China is doing, and I think, Eric, you're asking really good, hard questions about, well, how is that different from what others are doing, in terms of basing or in terms of going in and mining and these kinds of things. And I think, where I see the difference is, what comes as part of that package, right? And so when we think about, for instance, this supposed deal that went down with the Solomon Islands around potential military base there, what concerned me most was not China's going to have a base there, although that is concerning, and it certainly should be concerning for the Australians and others in that region. But it's more about the other parts of that deal that we saw about potentially China being able to send in security services in order to protect stability in a situation there if things got out of place. And of course, there was some pushback that, that's not exactly what it means. But I think there's good reason to believe that a lot of its potential basing, this applies to Equatorial Guinea or anywhere else in Africa, what else comes with that in terms of what it means for the internal dynamics in those countries and the way in which China might put its finger on a scale to help the resident autocrat to stay in power if it serves China's interests. So that's one part of the question. And the other is just the general back and forth on this notion of, African agency versus Chinese culpability. And I think that there's plenty of reason to say, African governments are at part to blame for what happens when they sign up to things that are not good for their people. But I don't think that wipes away the Chinese culpability. It's like basically the Africans leaving the windows open and then the Chinese come in at night and steal something, right? I mean, that's whatever analogy you want to use. There's enough culpability to go around, and then you add on to that, I don't know how to factor this into my house analogy, but you add into that the fact that, as we were talking about earlier, China's helping those governments to suppress their own civil society and their own independent media that would be keeping those officials honest, right? So that's kind of some questions, but also comments.
I think that what David here is getting at is that, we'd like to think that stealing a penny is the same thing as stealing a billion pennies, but we all know that's not true. We all know that size matters, and that when you look at the impact of a large country, it's almost like a large planet. It changes the way in which the rest of the international community works. And so the way that China changes the interaction and provides technologies, Huawei, other things that are just beyond what would have normally been or what was ever really available, I think it's a game changer in a lot of ways, and it is empowering to people who would like to maintain the controls. Now, if you ask an autocrat, if this information that all the faces of your country we're collecting on the facial recognition, it's going to go to you, but it also goes to Beijing. Are you okay with that? Maybe they would say, yeah, I'm okay with that because it keeps me in power. No other country is going to make that deal, right? That's something only China can really do. And so I think that we have to recognize that the size. I used to refer to it as the mothership, right, of this kind of technology. Others may have it, but they're not game changers in the way that China is. And so I think that's something we need to take into consideration, because stealing a penny is not like stealing a billion pennies. It has size, and that's important.
We've talked a lot about the Chinese autocrats, and I don't think that's entirely fair, because you'll find that the reception among democratic governments in Africa, Liberia, South Africa, Kenya, the biggest democrat, Nigeria, Democrat elected politicians, what do they love to do no matter where they are in the world?
Win elections.
Yes, but how do you win elections, whether it's in America or whether it's in Namibia, is you cut ribbons and you deliver goods. One of the things that the Chinese do better than almost anybody is that they will build something in 18 months in the term of a political leader. So what the research from Jude Moore at the Center for Global Development will tell you is that the popularity of the Chinese in democracies is often higher than it is in autocracies who are not actually accountable to their people. And again, this is all, we can disagree with it, but democratically elected politicians like Uhuru Kenyatta, like Cyril Ramaphosa, love the Chinese because they deliver on infrastructure, and that is to their administration and their campaigns. Very positive.
Look, the U.S. isn't building infrastructure in the U.S., let alone in Africa. We have to be frank here, and one of the reasons the Chinese, as you and I talked about, are moving away from it, is because railways are almost never money-making ventures. What they do is they synergize your economy so that your GDP may go up, but you may lose money on that railway. You may lose money on that highway. And so how do you convince a private investor to come in and build a railway when we can't even fix Amtrak because there's no money in it?
Yeah, but to be fair,
so to say that the Chinese are these, hold on, let me finish the sentence. To say that the Chinese are building infrastructure and we're not, and so they're good and we're bad, is to I think, misunderstand that the nature of the economics of the United States. We have quarterly earnings reports. Joe Biden cannot come in and say, you're going to build this railway. You know who has to say that? The shareholders of that company. And if they say, our new portfolio is building railways in Africa, what's going to happen to their stock tomorrow?
Josh, but literally that's what Biden is saying, though. They with B3W, and the next week they're going to launch.
And it's not working. And it's not working.
But this straw man of railways losing money, I looked this up. The German National Railway was subsidized to the tune of 18 billion euros last year. SNCF was subsidized to the tune of 12 billion euros last year. Amtrak, railways, except in Japan, don't make money. And then you see this criticism coming in from Westerners to Kenyans about saying, you built a white elephant, and the Kenyans will turn around and say, where is the profitable railroad in the world?
Well, and that's true.
You need a railroad to move goods and people.
If you are going to build something like this, what you're looking for is to enhance, from an economic perspective, you want to enhance the mobility, labor mobility, capital mobility within your society, which then causes you to have an increase in GDP growth. But it doesn't necessarily make the railway profitable, right? These are two different things. And I think, and if I would guess, this is why the Chinese are moving to, I think, what was it, small and beautiful, right? They're trying to move towards things which are profitable, and are not necessarily going to be loss leaders, but it helps when you have a name brand in that country, and you can build a name brand by building something that people take a recognition and say, well, you did this, then you can do that, and then you can create a brand. But U.S. infrastructure companies, yes, they're not building in Africa.
The exception to what Josh is saying is in Southeast Asia, where the Chinese are continuing to build massive railways into Vientiane, all the way down to Singapore,
They're
into
finishing
Vietnam.
that, right?
No. They're extending all the way into Bangkok. They see the railways as kind of like claws that can hold into Southeast Asia. That's the only place in the world where they're building railways.
And then, of course, China cares more about Southeast Asia, in part because of the proximity and importance of Southeast Asia. I would say that these projects that you're talking about have long been in the works, and so my argument would be they're finishing what they had 10 years ago, said this is our plan. And my old advisor, Mike Lampton, wrote a book about this with some folks in Singapore about this project. I actually was the peer reviewer on the project, which is fun when you get to review your own advisor's proposal. I let it go through the story.
Okay, in the back.
Hi, I'm Michael, and my question is about railways. When I was in South Africa in the 70s, China built the Tanzan from Dar es Salaam to the Copper Belt in Zambia, because Zambia wanted to be less dependent on South Africa and Portugal, and not to export via South Africa or Beira or Luanda. What is the status today of the Tanzan? I remember growing up in South Africa, there was a whole outcry that it's China preparing to invade South Africa, and the gauge of the railway was a unique Chinese gauge. What is the status today of this railway?
So, I think that the major contribution of the Tanzan Railway was political, right? That it said that, the World Bank isn't going to do this, but we are going to do this, right? We are going to cut this railway through the jungle, and we're going to build this thing, even if the West says it's not viable. Well, guess what? It wasn't viable. My understanding is it didn't work very well, and it took, I don't even know if they've still paid off the debt. I know China's written off portions of it. They've written it off, but it wasn't paid back. Okay, it was written off decades later. What Ambassador Shin is fond of telling me is, we loved it as America because we weren't going to cut our way through the jungle, but we were more than happy to build a road next to that railway, which was functioning. Even after the railway stopped functioning, that road was still effective. And I do believe there's been some rehabilitation efforts
They just
to the railway.
announced, Director General Wu Peng was in Lusaka, and they just announced they're going to upgrade the Tazara.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a very important political symbol of China saying to the West, you say no, but we are going to do it anyway. We will not follow your rules. And that is a very important kind of signaling effect on African interlocutors, right? That China is a very important other that they can work with. When the World Bank says no, maybe China will say yes. But I think that this goes to the point earlier made that I don't know how much of that is in the works going forward. I think a lot of that may be in the past that small and beautiful may be their way, and more technologically oriented, more high-tech driven, rather than the kind of low-tech infrastructure. I think they're more interested in 5G networks, they're more interested in the security networks, and other more sophisticated technology where they do believe that a profit can be driven. And as I understand it, and Eric he always tells me when I'm wrong, so I have faith. But a lot of this is also to collect data to improve their algorithms on the security side. So Chinese AI is very good at recognizing Chinese faces. It's pretty darn good at recognizing white faces, but to my knowledge, it's still not very good with African faces. And so you give Zimbabwe the security network for free. What you get is to improve your algorithm with every face it collects, such that you become the security provider on the continent, and you improve your security technology at the same time. It's a win-win.
Okay, we have time for one last quick question. Does anybody have a quick question? Okay, if not, then we're going to get some final thoughts for you about the book, about when it's going to come out, and what's ahead.
So, any of you who've worked with an academic press know that they run at the speed of the Tanzan Railway. Okay, so we're submitting the book to press in September, which means it's probably going to come out in like 2030. No, it's going to come out about 9 months later once they go through all of the rigmarole. We're through the peer review process, thankfully. The contract is signed. But now we've got to finish the process of updating the book according to what those reviewers have said, and academic reviewers who are hiding behind anonymity often have a lot of comments to make, as I see some nods in the audience here. So we're going to update it, we're going to get it as good as we can, and then it's going to be out by this time next year. That the book will be out. And so, please buy it. It's a stocking stuffer, right? But we're really excited though, because we see the entire field is moving towards higher quality research, right? And we are thrilled to be part of that endeavor. And I believe this conference is part of that endeavor. You guys have just been privy to my mind, and I guess I'm self-interested, two of the best panels I've heard on this topic in the last 3 or 4 years. And I think we're going to hear it in the same in the afternoon. And so you can get a sense of the high quality of academic research that is now being driven, that in my opinion was not happening even 5 or 6 years ago. And so we're thrilled to be part of that, part of this wave of high quality research, and then the new courses, etc., that are putting out. Just one data point. Last year, 2 years ago, I taught my course, China in the Developing World at Notre Dame. I had 8 students. Last semester, I had 27. All right. So this, even while China is seeming to pull back a little bit in terms of its tourism, etc., this is an issue that is more on the minds than maybe ever before. So I guess that's the pitch.
Okay. Thank you very much.